In a minute, I'll give you a couple of examples of authorial variants. First, though, it's important to emphasize that an author's later intervention, his second thoughts, we may say, can be extensive and invasive to the point of altering the work's structure and bring about a new redaction of that text. In that case, the changes that the author has introduced in the tradition are too many and too significant to be relegated in the apparatus, even an apparatus separate from that reporting the other, that is, non-authorial variants. The best and most manageable solution will then be to discuss these philological issues at length in the introduction to the text. As for the addition, in a case like this, it should be limited to one version only, say text A or text B. A rationale to be adopted about which of the two texts to prefer is as follows. If the author's changes in various levels of the manuscript tradition prove consistent, thus revealing a general plan on his part to revise the whole text, one can legitimately prefer text B as transmitting the author's final intentions, his last will, so to speak. Text B would thus preserve the form in which he wanted his work to circulate. It may happen, on the other hand, that the variants introduced by the author in several extant manuscripts do not possess these characteristics. They may simply be sporadic corrections or simple variants, synonyms for instance, replacing one word with another, caused by a change in the author's literary taste. In this second case, it would be preferable to publish text A instead, because of its greater overall consistency. Since this video is meant as a mere introduction to philology, I'll give you two basic examples of what I've just described. Both of them pertain to the simpler scenario, that is, a humanist intervening in the tradition of his own works, that is, the manuscripts that have come down to us, without altering the whole structure of that text. Though far from complex, I trust that these cases will make it clear how important it is to know an author's style and writing habits when dealing with this kind of philological problem. The text I'm going to use is one we have already referred to in our video, Manetti's History of Pistoia. I'm choosing this work to stress once again the importance of being well acquainted with the author in question when having to determine whether the readings we are concerned with can be regarded as authorial variants or not. Now, Manetti held Bruni in the highest esteem, as we said already. We also pointed out that much of Manetti's prose is modeled on the works of this older humanist. The History of Pistoia is no exception, borrowing extensively, in terms of both style and contents, from Bruni's History of Florence. As Manetti says in the preface, he wrote this piece of historiography consisting of 3 books in less than 6 months. After assembling the materials in the fall of 1446, he started writing in winter 46-47, finally offering the dedication copy now lost to the authorities of Pistoia in July 1447. During those months, Manetti was not only serving in that Tuscan city as chief police officer, but also had to lead an important embassy to the newly elected Pope Nicholas V on account of the Florentine Republic. As he laments in the preface, his writing the history of Pistoia was often interrupted by all sorts of more or less pressing commitments, which included running his own business company, since Manetti was a wealthy merchant. It is thus remarkable that he managed to produce such a lengthy and informative work in so short a time. What is not surprising, instead, is that several errors join the whole tradition, consisting of 7 manuscripts, of a work that was put together in such a hurry. It is thus perfectly understandable that Manetti was eager to check copies of his History of Pistoia and, if need be, make changes to the text or correct it. This it could do with enough ease. Most surviving copies were made in Tuscany, mostly Florence and Pistoia, and in Rome, especially at the papal court that Manetti often visited, both for private and public reasons, before eventually serving there for several years as secretary. The same was probably true of those, the vast majority, that did not come down to us. Of the main humanistic centers of the time, only Naples, where Manetti's work were popular, and maybe Venice, should be added. Finally, a copy of the History of Pistoia was made for the library of Frederick, Duke of Urbino, by Manetti's best friend and great admirer, Vespasiano da Bisticci, the famous Florentine bookseller. Again, Manetti, like all humanists of repute, could easily have access to copies of his own works. Limiting our discussion to variants that could be attributed to Manetti, I'd like briefly to illustrate a couple of cases. First, in Book 1, Chapter 89, Manetti, speaking of Florence's second military expedition against Pistoia in 1251, uses the formula Florentini optimarum partium duces, the leaders of the Florentine optimates, to refer to the Guelphs, that is, the leading members of the Guelph party, supporters of the papal faction, opposed to the Ghibellines, who sided with the emperor instead. In the Historia Florentini Populi, that is Manetti's main source both in this passage and for his whole work on Pistoia, Bruni consistently prefers the classical formula optimates in Latin to the traditional, that is medieval Guelphi. The optimates would be literally the best men, that is the aristocrats, as opposed to the plebeians, the populares. Consistently with this use, Bruni employs the formula optimates in the passage Historia Florentini Populi, Book 2, Chapter 3, corresponding to Book 1, Chapter 28 of Manetti's Historia Pistoriensis. This said, two things are now worthy of attention. First, embracing a more traditional ideology than Bruni, Manetti almost always prefers Guelphi, the medieval word, to optimates, which one finds in ancient Roman historians. Second, manuscripts R and N in the history of Pistoia's Stemma Codicum are the only ones in the whole tradition that read Guelpharum Partium instead of Optimarum Partium in the passage I've just quoted. More than the rest of the family tree, this area, that is delta and its descendants, thus including epsilon and the two witnesses R and N, has preserved a number of corrections and variants that should most likely be ascribed to Manetti himself. No extant copy of this work has come down to us, preserving interventions in the author's own hand. This is, of course, a pity, especially considering that Manetti's hand has been identified in the margins and the fly-leaves of many Latin, Greek, and Hebrew manuscripts originally belonging to his own library, most of which are now at the Vatican Library. Yet, it is more than justified to surmise that he inserted such readings in copies that are now lost. These lost copies would be so-called codices interpositi, that is, manuscripts that, because of readings and mistakes useful to reconstruct them, we can locate between an ancestor and its descendants in the family tree of the history of Pistoia. Philologists note that the number of surviving manuscripts for any given work is always remarkably less than those that were produced. On average, it is fair to say that for each manuscript that has survived, at least another 7 have been lost, but in most cases, the decimation rate must have been up to 9 or 10 for each surviving copy. This data and the high decimation rate remind us once again that any Stemma Codicum is just a working hypothesis based on the limited number of copies that has survived, not a faithful reproduction of the whole tradition. Nevertheless, we should not go to the opposite extreme, thus disregarding information provided by a complete collation of the surviving copies and the relationships between them that we have managed to trace. In the case of Manetti's Historia Pistoriensis, the presence of early witnesses at the bottom of the Stemma Codicum shows that this work must have circulated very fast and enjoyed a much greater success than the few extant copies suggest. It is thus legitimate to believe that it was Manetti himself who changed the original expression optimarium partium, that he borrowed from Bruni, to Guelpharum partium when he came across a manuscript, now lost, as such a codex interpositus, placed between what I called epsilon in the Stemma Codicum and its descendants, manuscripts R and N. Manetti thus took the opportunity to further remove his text from Bruni's model that he had followed in a hurry by modifying that formula according to his own taste. The same phenomenon occurs in other sections of this same family tree, as I said before. Branch alpha of the Stemma Codicum too is not immune from cases that could be regarded as authorial variants. Let me offer one more example before making some conclusive remarks on this matter. Manuscripts V and U, both descending from alpha, were very close to Manetti. Manuscript V belonged to Manetti's private library and was probably put together under his own supervision. As such, it stands out as an ideograph, to use philological jargon. As for manuscripts U, it was produced by Vespasiano da Bisticci's workshop for the prestigious library of Frederick II, Duke of Urbino. And yet, neither one of them is free from mistakes, including serious ones, such as lacunae, that is, omissions. What is noteworthy for the matter at hand is a series of readings, once again consistent with Manetti's style, that only these two manuscripts preserve. A case in point occurs in Book 3, Chapter 52, where Manetti, relying as usual on Bruni's Historia Florentini Populi, narrates how Giovanni Visconti, Lord of Milan, waged war on Florence in 1351 with an army largely consisting of mercenary soldiers. Whereas all witnesses of the Historia Pistoriensis in this passage read Hanc tantam et tam magnam predictorum hominum multitudinem, this vast and large crowd of people mentioned above, manuscripts U and V are the only ones to report the following Lectio Difficilior, a more difficult reading and as such more likely to be authorial than a so-called trivialization or Lectio Facilior. Quote, Hanc tantam et tam magnam perditorum hominum multitudinem, that is, this vast and large crowd of despicable people. Manetti often uses the adjective perditus, despicable, in his works. Also, the episode he reports here pits Florence against Milan, as often happened in late medieval and early Renaissance history. It is thus plausible to hold that this variant too, like others attested by the two exemplars in question, was inserted by Manetti in their common and now lost antigraph. A couple of conclusive remarks before we move on to the last two topics that I wish to discuss, marginal notes and punctuation. First, as you have seen, knowing a humanist style and work method is of great importance in all cases. This is particularly true when dealing with so-called moving archetypes or variable archetypes, also known as authorial variants. Especially when lacking witnesses with corrections in the author's own hand, style is the main piece of evidence that a philologist can rely on to solve a problem of this nature. Second, one must examine the extant witnesses very closely so as to determine their place of origin, the date, and their location in the Stemma Codicum. No less important is to understand what kind of scribe we're dealing with. Reading a manuscript, or a witness, as philologists are fond to say, leads to determine the scribe's psychological profile. It's a bit like reading his character and, so to speak, psych him out. Various elements suggest whether it's the scribe himself who intervenes and corrects certain readings in the margin of the manuscript or between the lines, marginalia and interlinear corrections respectively, as I said before. Variants in the margins can even reveal that he collated the manuscript with another copy of that same text, thus providing visual evidence of what philologists call contamination or horizontal transmissions versus vertical transmission, that is, from the higher to the lower level of the family tree, as one would hope to keep things simple. If, as in all the cases discussed above, the scribe proves to be passive, unwilling to change the text that he is transcribing, or incapable of fixing a corrupt passage, the interventions that we illustrated before would not be in keeping with his profile. It is thus more likely that any variants in his copy are not his making, but that he found them instead in the antigraph, now lost, from which his own copy, the so-called epigraph, derived.